to introduce tonight's special guest is our Executive Vice President and past Programs Vice President, Mr. Jerry Mungat.
Joel, where are you? Are you supposed to be doing this? Good evening. Tonight, as you know, we have two speakers, Steve Forbes and Elizabeth Ames. And Elizabeth will follow Steve tonight, so we thought we would do the logical thing and introduce the second speaker first. Elizabeth Ames is the founder and owner of Bold Public Relations and Communications. And as an entrepreneur, she learned quickly that economic freedom was a fundamental requirement for businesses to grow and to create jobs. A lesson that Obama has yet to learn. Prior to starting Bold, she worked as a financial journalist in various capacities in various organizations. She met Steve Forbes while working at USC, also known as the University of Spoiled Children. She later went on to work for Forbes and established its Office of Press Relations. She was a contributor to Forbes' book, Flat Tax Revolution, and co-authored with him How Capitalism Will Save Us and their latest book, Freedom Manifesto. So, with that I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Ames. Steve is descended from an entrepreneurial immigrant family. His grandfather immigrated to America from Scotland and founded Forbes Magazine in 1917. And the magazine is provocatively called the capitalist tool. Sounds sinister to the lips. While a Princeton undergrad, he was a co-founder of a student-run magazine called Business Today. And from what I can understand, it's the world's biggest student-run magazine. Pretty good. He took over the stewardship of Forbes Magazine in 1996, shortly after the death of his father. And under his stewardship, Forbes Media has become a leading multimedia source for business and financial information. He champions ideas that advance freedom and limited government. Ideas like the flat tax, one of his favorites, health savings accounts, personal retirement accounts, and parental school choice. In the world of politics, he ran unsuccessfully for the GOP nomination for president in 1996 and 2000. He's also supported many political candidates in both state and national races. Successful campaigns he supported include those of Senators Rand Paul and Marco Rubio. He also supported Rick Perry's bid for the 2012 GOP nomination for president. That one didn't work out as well. He is a prolific author and multimedia commentator, sits on many boards, including Heritage Foundation, and promotes conferences like the Forbes Global CEO Conference to be held next month in Bali. Attendance, by the way, is by invitation only. How many of you going? Maybe everything's negotiable, so afterwards you might ask them if you could go. So, tonight, their speakers are going to address the topic of the free market comeback. Please join me in welcoming Steve Forbes.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for those very kind words. Thank all of you for coming here tonight. I didn't know such a group existed in this area. I'm surprised the EPA hasn't designated you as an endangered species. Get some of that government protection. But it is great that you're now about to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Conservative Forum. And it just goes to show even in an area that is supposedly inhospitable, if you don't fight, you're not going to win. If you're not willing to go out and proselytize and get ideas across, you have no right to complain if things don't go right. And just as it looks like it's hopeless here, just remember, some of you, not too many of you, are old enough to remember the 70s and 80s. It's called pandering. Tried it in politics, didn't work, which is why we're here tonight. But back then, California was a red state. It wasn't until 1992 a Democrat won a presidential election here. So these things do change. Now, the topic that we're discussing tonight is, of course, a fundamental one, and that is why governments get bigger and bigger. We all know it happens, but not since Calvin Coolidge have we had a president that presided over a decline in the size of the federal government. Not even Ronald Reagan, despite his best efforts, could do it. The fact that government is riddled with inefficiencies and failures and abuses doesn't seem to stop its growth for very long. We have the most extraordinary event of the 20th century, the abject failure of socialism. So why is it that government gets bigger? And I want to emphasize, we're talking about big government, not the government envisioned by James Madison, father of our Constitution, our other founders. Madison was right. He said if we were angels, we'd not need laws, we'd not need government. We are not angels, manifestly, except for maybe grandchildren, but they only to a certain age. So we're emphasizing big government. And one of the things that advocates of big government always do, what these advocates do, is they paint it as a choice between big government, numerous regulations, and anarchy. They make it sound like that if you're not in favor of big government, you're in favor of no laws against fraud or crime, no laws to protect food, no laws on speed limits in school zones. And so you're not going to win that argument. Madison would say you wouldn't win it. But there's a manifest difference between sensible rules of the road, such as not driving while you're drunk, and government telling you what to drive, where to drive, and when to drive. So why is it that government gets bigger when we see the failure and the tyranny all around us? Well, there are two basic reasons. One, of course, is human nature. There was an historian called C. Northcote Parkinson. He was a Brit. Isn't that a wonderful British name, C. Northcote Parkinson? Rolls off the tongue. Yes, it must be a Brit, the name like that. But he was an historian in the 1950s. He was writing a history of the British Navy. And he noticed something very peculiar. He noticed that after World War I, when Britain had the largest navy in the world, Navy was bigger than any other two navies combined, because it was Britain's frontline defense when it was a great power. After the First World War, when everyone thought we wouldn't have big wars anymore, naturally the British sharply downsized the size of the Navy. Mothballed ships, discharged sailors, laid off dock workers, huge downsizing. And yet during this downsizing, Parkinson noticed, the government agency running the Navy got bigger. Navy smaller, bureaucracy running it bigger. He said, how could this happen? Well, he noticed that among human organizations, left to their own devices, always forget their original purpose and just become more bloated and bigger. And he came up with one of his laws, that the amount of work an organization does has nothing to do with the size of the organization. Even if it has very little to do, you'll always look and feel very busy. So that's one reason why government gets bigger. We see it down today in terms of human nature. Look what's happening with these agencies, ignoring the Constitution. In the iPad, on Obamacare, 15 people, no accountability in effect. There's some fig leaves of accountability, but they're meaningless. That's a death panel. And Howard Dean, not a conservative, wrote a piece in the Journal the other day decrying IPAD, Independent Payment Advisory Board. Love these wonderful euphemistic names. They choose what treatments are going to be approved and what won't. We know where that leads. If more than one person observes, the government controls your health, it controls you. You see it in this Consumer Protection Agency, ensconced in the Federal Reserve. No accountability, no appropriations. They just scoop their money created by the Fed. Can't even take them to court most of the time. Where in the world did these institutions come along? It's like in terms of what we just heard about SB1. I mean, that's Soviet Union determining where you live, population control. Last I looked, we won the Cold War. Now we're giving it up here. So that's one reason. Left to their own devices, it'll just become bigger and more tyrannical. But there's another reason. This is what we address in the book. Amazingly, for all of its failures, for all of its injustices, big government still occupies the high moral ground. Maybe bloated, inefficient, tarred by scandals, but hey, its heart is in the right place. It's all about compassion. It promotes the public good, helps the poor, the elderly, the weak. It educates us, or tries to. Responds when there are disasters, not always effectively, but they mean well. They try to keep free markets from going off the rails, dealing with the excesses of free markets, clean up after financial disasters, like the recent financial crisis or the Great Depression. Free markets, by contrast, in this myth, are cold, uncaring, hard-hearted, amoral if not immoral. Free markets, according to this myth, is based on greed and avarice. Grubby, not noble. Profits before people. How many of you heard that one? As if the two are on opposite poles. May supply material goods, but it's a kind of corrupt bargain. Just think of the phrase, giving back. I use it, we all use it. But step back for a moment. Giving back sounds like you took something that didn't belong to you in the first place. You know, Johnny takes something from Sarah. Give it back, Johnny, it doesn't belong to you. And so if you succeed in free markets, you make up for your sins by giving it away, giving back what you took that really wasn't yours in the first place. So to say that free markets work won't suffice. It's not enough. You're always going to lose ground if people feel that something is kind of grubby about it. So our book turns those myths on their heads, turns the conventional wisdom 180 degrees. We make the case that it is big government that is short-sighted, big government that is selfish and meets its own needs first, hurts people trying to get ahead, hurts opportunity. Big government stultifies innovation, sows distrust, and encourages conflict. Short-sighted, big government, next election. Contrast that to the pharmaceutical industry, always attacked by big government. 10, 12, 15, 20 years before you get a payout. Yet they get called greedy and short-sighted. Government meeting its own needs, you see it happen all the time. Remember that school strike in Chicago a few months back? Third largest school system in the country, one of the worst in the country. What were the issues? Not about the miserable education they're supplying poor people. It was all about pay, pensions, benefits. You saw it too in how they dealt with GM bankruptcy. We have bankruptcy laws in this country to deal with institutions that fail. That was a purely political settlement. Shaft the bondholders, pay off your political beneficiaries, just like they do in the third world. Take Social Security. Look at how they fund that. On paper, remember the debt crisis 2 years ago? The debt ceiling crisis, about to have another one. The president threatened to stop Social Security payments because the money wasn't going to be there, shut the government down. Well, that begged the question. On paper, the Social Security trust funds have $2.5 trillion in reserves, enough for over 3 years of benefits. So what's the problem? The government shut for a month or two, you could pay the benefits for 3 years, still have money left over. The trust funds, on paper, $2.5 trillion, in reality is Zippo, non-marketable IOUs from the Treasury Department. They spent the money. Talk about double dipping. They take the money from you, don't save it, and then tax you again to pay the money that they should have saved in the first place. Now imagine if you did that in the private sector. Took money from workers, say, just for your pensions, spend it, and then give you an IOU that's worthless? You wouldn't be here. You'd be wearing big stripes, doing underpaid labor. No minimum wages in jails. And yet, that's government in action. And so, in terms of conflict, government says it's always trying to help the people, but only thrives in conflict. 1% versus the 99%. Always a crisis, one group against another group. You're against what they want to do in terms of planning where you live. That means obviously you're rich, uncaring, and selfish and want to spit on the poor. They always thrive on conflict. And this gets to free markets. Free markets are moral because, unlike government, which meets its own needs, free markets meet people's needs and wants. Think of it. You don't succeed in free markets unless you provide something that somebody else wants. It's not greed, it's about transactions. Adam Smith talked about the baker and the butcher meeting your needs when you want dinner. They want your money, you want their food. Each gets something from the transaction. It's a trade. We do it zillions of times each week. Now, some transactions are more fun than others. Buying a pair of shoes or a fancy sports car, much more fun than paying the electricity bill or the rent if you're a renter. Although human nature being what it is, those who complain about the electricity bill then go out and spend $200 on a pair of blue jeans that look like they came out of a dumpster. But it is about mutual reciprocity. So even if you're in business and you live up to that Hollywood cliche, research has shown that in Hollywood movies, businessmen kill more people than serial killers. And either they're bloatedly fat and jolly, they're flubbering up and down in the cheeks, and their glee at polluting the water, or they're skinny, bony, thin with nibbly fingers, rubbing hands in glee. Now they can figure out how to poison your pets, blow up your house or whatever. Even if you have that terrible personality, it makes babies cry and dogs bark when you walk down the street. Even if you lust for money, you don't get it unless you provide something that somebody else wants. Without you knowing it, it forces you to pay attention or try to figure out what somebody might want and persuade them to do it. And so free markets encourage cooperation. We're going to have dinner tonight. Restaurants. You're a restaurateur, you assume. Farmers grow the food. Private companies process the food. Truckers and others deliver the food. Somebody makes the refrigerator, the utensils, the furniture, provides the electricity. All these myriad things. It happens. Nobody's in charge. That's why it works. Look at Apple. Extraordinary global supply chain. Now, the parts are put together in China. But on the iPhone, out of $170 worth of parts, only $6.50 worth are actually manufactured in China. The rest are assembled around the world from scores of plants. Germany, Japan, Malaysia. $10 of parts are made here in the United States. Go to China, assemble, and then come back here. Extraordinarily mind-numbingly complex supply chains. People making things happen. Another thing about free markets, which sounds strange, is it encourages trust. Think of it. When you go to a restaurant, they trust you're going to pay the bill. eBay. I mean, if somebody had come to you 25 years ago with the idea of an eBay, you'd say, no way. Deal with people you're not even in business, can't go to the Best Business Bureau. You're going to do transactions like that? Can't trust somebody you don't know. So free markets invent instruments of trust. PayPal comes along. This happens all the time. Big government always portrays itself as a lover of humanity. They love you so much that they love you even when you're dead. Somebody said previously, their father was a lifelong Republican. When he died, he started to vote Democrat. But in reality, free markets encourage humanity. We take it for example in this country. If you want to do something, you want to get the best people possible. You think that's the most natural thing in the world. You want to get a good team together, make it happen. That's new in human affairs. It wasn't until really recent times that you would trust anyone beyond your immediate family, or your tribe, or your ethnic group. In free markets, you got to put the best talent together. And so you may not love your neighbor, but you sure want to sell to your neighbor. So instead of blowing them up, you like to get his credit card and, get some sales. You look at Ireland, tenuous peace after 300 years of conflict between Protestant and Catholic in Northern Ireland. Now what brought about that tenuous peace? It was not suddenly great diplomacy, although it was great diplomacy, but it didn't work for decades, nothing to show for it. What changed the dynamic there was the extraordinary change in the Irish Republic. Starting in the 70s, where Ireland went from the most stagnant economy in Europe into the most dynamic. Extraordinary story. Even during this economic crisis, which was caused by the stupid government in Ireland guaranteeing all the liabilities of its banks, should have called up the Fed and said, we want some loans. The Fed was glad to comply. Doing it with everybody else, why should they discriminate against the Irish? But the government made a huge mistake, put its country through unnecessary turmoil, but the country's starting to come back again. It was that great boom in Ireland that changed the dynamic in Northern Ireland and got people thinking about it beyond their parochial conflicts. We have a cover story in the new issue, behind the scenes. Nobody knew. John Chambers at Cisco and others working. Numerous contacts between business people in Israel among the Palestinians. Palestinians, by tradition, very mercantile people, very smart. Crazy politics there, behind the scenes, business people trying to create an environment not going to work next week, but in the future, or maybe, thanks to greater commerce, something might happen there. It's not going to just be diplomacy or John Kerry or anything else. It's going to be what happened in Ireland. Creativity, innovation. It's not enough to invent something. China invented the compass, paper, a lot of other things. Without free markets, they don't get developed. They don't get put into the next stage and the next stage. Creativity can be big things, like the microchip. It can be small things. Happens all the time. You go to Starbucks or other coffee places, you notice you usually have 3 sizes, 12-ounce, 16-ounce, 20-ounce cups. But you notice the lids are all the same size.
Yeah.
So you don't have to have 3 different inventories. Those little things happen all the time. Don't even notice them. That kind of innovation is encouraged in the marketplace. The most unlikely people can succeed. Larry Ellison, orphan, Oracle. Steve Jobs, abandoned by his biological parents. Michael Dell, dropped out of college. Wonderful story I just have to quickly share about Dell. He didn't want to go to college. His parents said, you must. So he goes to the University of Texas. Gets to his dorm room, immediately starts setting up his computer business. One day he gets a call from his parents, said, Michael, we're going to come by. Now usually if parents call a kid, they got to get either with the boyfriend or the girlfriend out, clean the place up, cute kid, With Dell, the problem was where to hide the inventory. And so he finally found a hiding place. Parents come, look around the room and say, Michael, something's wrong here. He said, what? Parents said, no books, no textbooks. He said, oh my God, I forgot to buy them. So it can be a young age, it can be older. Yogi Berra was right, it's not over till it's over. Now, for any nutritionists here, forgive me for what I'm about to do, but Ray Kroc, McDonald's, whole life, trying to do the big hit, never really did. So here he is in his mid-50s. This is back in the 50s, where 55 was like 70 today. selling milkshake machines. One day he hears about, stumbles across a hamburger stand called McDonald Brothers. Sees they're doing a brisk business, gets the idea, light bulb goes over the head. Gee, if I get these guys to expand, I can sell more milkshake machines. Well, long story short, McDonald Brothers didn't have that vision, bought him out. So here he is in the 60s and 70s, when most people are hanging up, he's just hitting his stride. But there's a real story here. Any of you know, worked in a restaurant, knows the toughest business possible. What you did yesterday means nothing today. Your inventory literally goes bad on you as you're standing there. Tough business, high casualty rate. Chain, impossible. Maybe you might get a regional chain like Howard Johnson's in New England, Harvey's in the 19th century, railroad stations, but small number. Kroc saw something. He saw that these guys had invented something they didn't really realize they invented. They standardized restaurants. Remember back in the 50s, diners, they still do today. I love diners. They have 1,800 items on the menu. Love to read the menu, spend your whole evening reading the menu. McDonald's just had a few standard items, but he realized you can build a base on that and standardize everything. National chain, international chain, now we think it's no big deal to have restaurant chains of every variety. Ray Kroc was the first to see how it could be done. The inventors actually didn't realize what they had done. Took an outsider to do it. This happens all the time. If as you look to the future, free markets, misers do not found Microsofts and Walmarts. Just focused on the present. Optimism. It encourages optimism. You don't make an investment if you don't think there's a future. Just clutch your cash. Responsibility. Free markets are about responsibility. You learn. The nice thing about free markets is you learn from failures as well as successes. Talk about Steve Jobs, iPod, did that come out of the air? No. You had the Walkman, which should have evolved into the iPod, but Sony didn't do it. You had the Newton and other failures in Apple, but you learned. That's how you got the iPod. It doesn't happen all at once. And Jobs himself, you read that biography by Walter Isaacson on Jobs, terrible personality. Oprah wouldn't get 10 miles of him. Nasty guy. Fired from his own company before the age of 30. He was so impossible. Painful 12 years. Some failures, some successes. By the time he came back to Apple, though, he learned painfully, despite his personality, how to become an effective leader. Keep talented people together for a shared purpose. That just didn't happen. Through the experience of freedom, you'll learn from success and failure. They always say, economists, they should be shot for this, that economics is about the allocation of scarce resources, not the kind of thing that get the blood going. Actually, it's about the creation of resources. Take, for example, what we think of as a natural resource, oil. What is oil? Oil in and of itself is glop. Gooey stuff. You can't eat it, you can't drink it, can't feed it to cows. What's it good for? It's human ingenuity that made this goo something a modern economy can't live without. Also, free markets are about turning scarcity into abundance. Scarcity into surpluses, commodities. It happens all the time. Take the automobile. Huge thing. 110 years ago, a typical car cost the equivalent today of $125,000. It was a toy for the rich. Along comes Henry Ford. Painfully, over the years, he and his engineers invent the moving assembly line, which turned a toy for the rich into something every working person could afford. Cell phones. See a cell phone 30 years ago? Big as a shoebox. Heavy. 40-minute battery life. The first one out of Motorola, $3,995. I guarantee if big government said then everyone must have a cell phone, today they'd still be as big as a shoebox. Cost $10,995. And the president would be railing about greedy cell phone makers. Instead, there are over 6.5 billion around the world. The poorest of the poor have them. They do everything now way beyond voice, except maybe comb your hair, grow hair. Maybe the next model will do that for some of us. Who knows? Scarcity into abundance. That gets to the real resource in free markets. It's not things, it's the human mind. You could destroy everything around you as long as you have the mind. Eventually it will be rebuilt. As George Gilder points out in his new book, what's the difference between us today and people who lived in the Stone Age, lived in caves? Same people, Same materials on Earth. Difference is, between now and then, is that we know more. That is the essential difference. We know more. Learning, that's the difference. That's what free markets encourage. Economic crises, every single major economic crisis has as its origins big government. Massive government errors. This one, Federal Reserve, printing too much money. We never could have had a housing bubble if the Fed hadn't printed so much money 10 years ago. Juice would not have been there for it. But then big government blames the markets for its mistakes. It gets bigger. In free markets, if you don't provide something somebody wants, you fail. Big government, you fail, you get bigger. Strange. Let me just close by giving one example of where free markets are needed. And that is health care. Ask yourselves, why do we have a medical care crisis in this country? The answer is, well, people like me are getting older. We want more health care services, more medical care. It gets more expensive, so it becomes impossible. The system implodes. Ask yourself, why is the demand for medical care considered a crisis when the demand for everything else in this economy is considered an opportunity? People want more apps. Valley would be glad to help you out. Want more cars, manufacturers in Detroit and elsewhere, glad to help you out. What's with healthcare? The answer is we don't have real free markets in healthcare. We have pieces of it, which is why we still produce more pharmaceuticals, more medical devices until that Obama tax kicks in the rest of the world. But we don't have real free markets. We have a disconnect between providers and consumers. Patient's not the real customer. And think of it, because we've grown up with it, we don't realize how crazy it is. But when you go to the doctor, hospital, or clinic, and you ask in advance what it's going to cost, a very strange look. It's one of two things. Either you're uninsured, or you're a lunatic. I mean, what's it to you what it costs? It's for the insurer, the employer, the government to worry about. Imagine, you have dinner tonight, go order a nice wine, food, or whatever. Say, I don't care what it costs. Let Aetna or Blue Shield or Medicare worry about it. The system goes crazy. Why can't we do in healthcare what we do in food? Government ran food, ran agriculture. Government's involved in agriculture, but not suffocatingly. Government ran agriculture would have no more obesity. We'd all be starving. They tried in Russia and China, did not work out very well. So, agriculture produces the food when they're allowed to. The state doesn't take their water away. They produce the food. Truckers deliver the food. Private companies process the food. Everyone from grocery stores, supermarkets, hotels sell the food. You have problems getting the food, you have everything from food banks to food stamps to deal with it. Now you can debate about how food stamps are run these days, but the idea of a safety net is there. Why in the world can't we do the same thing in healthcare, have real entrepreneurship? Turn scarcity into abundance and have effective safety nets instead of the crazy quilt system we have today. It can be done. But people say, what about Bernie Madoff? Doesn't that show that free markets are crazy and immoral? It's like saying, you get fraud in elections. Does that mean you do away with free elections? No, you fix the problem. You got a problem? What's the problem? Fix it. That's what you do. So in our book, Elizabeth will talk about this. We make contrasts. First chapter, FedEx or the post office. Second chapter, freedom or Big Brother. Next chapter, Silicon Valley or Detroit. Next chapter, paychecks or food stamps. Apple or Solyndra. The spirit of Reagan or Obama. And so that's why we did this book. Elizabeth will now talk about how we not only need this new message, but how we get that message out there and how we start winning these battles. But keep in mind, we got to learn to get the vocabulary on this. Big government's heart is not in the right place. Our founders understood it. Free markets, for all their flaws, free markets are people. Whenever you have any institution involves people, it's going to have massive imperfections. That's a given. We are flawed. We're also capable of doing great things when allowed to do so. In a proper environment, the rule of law and freedom, great things will happen, which is why this country is the greatest country on earth. Not because we were born more virtuous, but we have more resources. Other countries have more resources. They have plenty of people. We have the environment that no other country has had. We must not lose it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me here today. It's great to be here at the Conservative Forum. Steve just talked about Freedom Manifesto and how it can shape our messaging about the benefits of economic freedom. However, if we are to win the war of ideas, we have to think about more than just the message. A young and very brilliant writer for Breitbart, Ben Shapiro, recently made the observation that believers in free markets are a lot like Seventh-day Adventists. They attempt to persuade people by going door to door. In contrast, he said, the big government side thinks institutionally, and as a result, they've managed to get critical sectors and institutions on their side. He was talking, of course, about the media, Hollywood, universities, and nonprofits, but much of Silicon Valley can also be included in this category. So how do we fix this problem? The solution really has three moving parts. Messaging, as I said, is just the first one, and the others are tactics and institutions. And I'm going to make a few comments on each. First, a little more about messaging. The left has always been skilled at propaganda. We wrote Freedom Manifesto to help people make the moral argument for free markets. And we illustrate these moral comparisons between government control and economic freedom by drawing on current events. And thanks to the Obama administration, there are new examples illustrating our comparisons just about every other day. Some of them are even more ominous than what we have in the book. For example, one of our chapters is titled Freedom versus Big Brother. Steve just mentioned that. And originally I was a little worried when we came up with that chapter title because I thought we might be accused of overstatement. Okay, that was before the IRS, the NSA, the FEC, metadata. All I can say is who knew? Who would ever imagine that Americans seeking to speak out in this country, groups with the word patriot in their names, would be asked by government to provide lists of their members and donors, and that some of those members and donors would be audited, or that you would be asked who you associated with, what you're reading, or what you say in your prayers. The targeting of ordinary people and the scope of what is happening today is truly unprecedented and very frightening. And for people who remember the Nixon administration, there's no comparison. It's far beyond anything that we ever were thinking about at that time. And our chapter on Silicon Valley versus Detroit, that's another example. It's also especially timely now in the wake of Detroit's bankruptcy. And those are just a couple of examples that you're going to find in the book. We wrote Freedom Manifesto to provide ways to push back against the left and its 60s cliches. And it can really, and we all know, we've all had the experience, it can be unpleasant engaging these people, especially when they're convinced that there's only one sane point of view. And they happen to think it's theirs, but, who knows? Anyway. But we need to be persistent to find out, we need to find ways to point out we need to be persistent to find ways to point out their inconsistencies and to ask them why, for example, how they feel a government that gave us the IRS, the DMV, Fannie and Freddie, and yes, the post office, should be telling doctors how to make life and death decisions about your health care. And we have an opportunity that we didn't have a few years ago now to drive home these messages, thanks to the administration's scandals, as well as the damage being done by Obamacare. People who were close to us before are now beginning to listen, so that's the positive side. We have an opportunity now, but are we really up to it? And that gets to the second moving part, successful communication. Successful communication is about tactics. Not only what you're saying, but how you're saying it. And that's where our problem lies. And we saw this in the 2012 presidential election. Yes, we know now that voices on our side were suppressed, but that's not the only reason why we lost. It's because our people were talking to each other. And you saw that when you watched the Republican convention. It was all about employers and entrepreneurs. But most voters are employees. The media said that Romney's mistake was that he couldn't communicate with women and Hispanics. And the press always loves to say that to marginalized conservatives. And I think, frankly, it's really, it's not what they say it is. The reality is that all people, regardless of ethnicity and gender, want the same things. They want freedom, personal choice, and opportunity. And the Romney campaign did not know how to drive this message home. And successful communication starts with knowing your audience. How do we talk to people who live from paycheck to paycheck and are worried about the future? We just have not done that very well. And we're up against the party of free stuff. And what are we offering? We need to think in terms of deliverables. We need to get across that a free enterprise economy is an opportunity economy. Our deliverables are mobility, fairness, abundance, empowerment, and a lower cost of living. And that last point is huge. Why isn't the GOP talking about inflation that people are noticing at the supermarket? And why aren't they talking about how the Obama administration has hit people in the pocketbook? I mean, you think this would be a no-brainer. You'd think this would have been a no-brainer during the election, and we should be talking about it right now. And we also need examples of real-life people to dramatize our points. That's something we really very rarely do, or we don't do it that well. We're always talking about numbers, green eye shade, deficits. It's never about people, okay? When the left was lobbying for Obamacare, we saw no end of hard cases of people who couldn't get insurance trotted out before the media. Well, today, we are currently seeing drug shortages, doctor shortages. Government is making it harder for physicians to independently make decisions. It's not happening in 2014. It's happening right now, and many people don't even know about it. And people are beginning to get the impact that Obamacare is having on the labor force, the loss of full-time jobs, but there's much more that we could be talking about right now. We should be getting our own stories out. Why aren't we doing it? We also have to develop new tools with the skills of some of the people in this room to target those who are most receptive to our ideas. And we need to figure out where to reach them online and everywhere else. We have to get better at social media. The other side excelled at this in 2012, and we have to catch up. The final part of our communication strategy, as I mentioned, involves institutions. Even when we have the right message, it gets distorted by the media and educational institutions that are dominated by status. And the answer isn't throwing them out of their jobs, as much as we'd like to do that, but starting more of our own institutions. And we're already doing this. 30 years ago, we really didn't have an opposition media in this country. And today, we not only have talk radio, but we have Fox News, countless outlets on the internet. There's Breitbart and The Blaze and The Daily Caller, Reason, Human Events, Town Hall, Hot Air, Drudge. And conservatives really don't even need to buy the Times or the Washington Post anymore. People don't fully appreciate what a sea change that really is. But these new outlets have to be supported, and they have to keep growing. And the same goes for education. We may not be able to change much of academia, but the internet offers new tools and opportunities to self-educate or to educate your kids. The Foundation for Economic Education, the online library for economics and liberty, Mises.org, those are just a few of the excellent resources that are out there, and we cite them, by the way, as sources in Freedom Manifesto, so you might find that useful. And many of these institutions did not exist 10 or 20 years ago. And that's one reason why I'm optimistic. The mainstream media is looking the other way and deliberately doing so. But we are definitely seeing a growth in the free market movement. And the conservative form is just one example. And also the Tea Party. People are reawakening to the meaning of economic and personal freedom. Not just because of Obama, but also because of the achievements of the technology industry. The last 30 years have been a positive lesson about the power of technology's free market creativity to change the world and improve our standard of living. And we talk about this in the book when we write about what we call the Staples Principle, which is the power of technology to create abundance. So where does this leave us? On one side, we have a free marketplace that has given us technology miracles of the past 30 years, and on the other side, you have an administration that spies on people and can't even get its health insurance exchanges off the ground. Because of these developments, the rise of a new conservative media and groups like yours, we are beginning to see a growing awareness of why free markets are moral and big government isn't. But there are still many communication challenges ahead. We hope this book will help you wage your own personal campaign. Thank you.
Now we have our Q&A session, and we have people passing out cards. If you have a question, they'll hand you a card, fill it out, they'll pick it up, have somebody read the question. And I think we're okay, right in the corner. We got it. You're working there, Jerry?
I can't, oh, there we go.
Yeah, there you go, I hear you.
Before we start, I want to acknowledge one of our visitors here is kind of a rare species in this area, former Republican Congressman Ernie Conyu.
Oh, yeah. I understand we also have a couple of visitors that came here all the way from Australia. Let's take a day.
The American electorate elected Obama twice. All polls indicate that Hillary has a commanding lead for 2016. How are we going to elect a person who believes in free enterprise, free markets, and limited government?
In terms of Hillary in 2016, she is beatable because she represents the past, and 2016 is going to be clearly a discredited past. Foreign policy, does anyone fear the United States or respect the United States in the world today? Do you think Vladimir Putin would be playing the games he's playing if Ronald Reagan was in office today? And so that's why she's beatable, but we have to have a candidate, and I think the process in 2016 will be such that we're going to have candidates who get it and realize you don't have to be articulate like Ronald Reagan, but you have to understand, you have to get across your positive message. And that is having real policies for the future, communicating why these policies and principles are good for you, good for America, good for the future. And that's how you win. Ronald Reagan realized in 1980 it wasn't enough to criticize Jimmy Carter. He always started off talking about radical tax cuts, rebuilding our military, continuing accelerating deregulation, killing inflation. And he delivered. And it's amazing we didn't build on that foundation. I mean, in 1980, if you had said we could win the Cold War in our lifetime, people would say, well, both sides with nuclear armaments, can't happen. It did happen. He was the first president who thought you could roll back what we used to call the Iron Curtain. Killing the inflation. Because Reagan was so successful, nobody talks about the terrible 70s anymore. Inflation seemed intractable. Malaise nation. In 2 years it was killed, painfully, but it was killed. And once again, we became the vibrant leader of the world. The Valley, Silicon Valley, became bywords for cutting-edge technology and innovation. So it's getting the message across. You don't have to worry about the Republican Party. I mean, I don't know how you feel, but having the GOP chairman say to NBC, we're not going to have debates with you. Well, I'm sure NBC said boo-hoo on that one. These are audience killers in their minds anyway. They're a leftist audience. Crazy stuff is that. But don't worry about the GOP. Take it over. Started doing it in 2010. We heard briefly from Tim earlier. Imagine winning the governorship here. You're not going to do it with rhinos. I'm talking about Republicans' name only, not rhinoceroses. I don't mind rhinoceroses. That kind of rhino I like at a distance. But it comes from fighting. And if candidates aren't willing to fight, get new candidates. That's the wonderful thing about technology. Get the message out very quickly. So we will have fights next year, but the fights on how we move ahead. And don't worry about divisions in the party. We're not going to agree on every issue. So what? We're a very, I don't mean this in a PC sense, we're a very diverse nation. We have numerous different interests. But you can unite for certain things. Take, for example, the beginning of the Republican Party back in the 1850s. Lincoln becomes president. Civil War looms. Republican Party, one of the key constituencies of the Republican Party were German immigrants. A big source of immigration in those days, German and Irish. German immigrants were primarily Republicans. Their kids were Republicans. Another part of the Republican Party, the new party, were what they called know-nothings. The old American Party, absolutely opposed to Irish immigration and German immigration, wanted to send them back. Virulent. So how do you get know-nothings and the Germans under one tent? Lincoln did it on the issue of slavery and the Union and a new birth of freedom. Reagan did it. Do you think the party was any less diverse in 1980 than it is today? No. But even though, families don't agree on everything. I don't agree with myself on everything. So I don't worry about having a primary, because as long as we know we may differ on certain particulars, but we know the value of liberty, and we're going to fight the other side. So we got to get away with this dichotomy. I know this is harsh, where some call the Republican Party the stupid party, the Democrats the evil party. We have to be the smart party. And we've got to understand the principles of liberty. So I don't mind if we have a fight. We just got to understand, we've got to put out a positive message. And so we've done it before, so that we're not doing any great invention here. What's amazing is that the last few elections, we didn't do it.
Yeah. This is a quick question that should be answered quickly. How much is your book tonight? What's the cost?
28.
The what?
28.
What is the cost of your book that you're autographing tonight?
$26, 2% off for cash. And as for the autograph you get when you buy it, heck, no one else will say it. Priceless.
Why does the flat tax proposal not eliminate the IRS as the fair tax does?
The flat tax will eliminate the IRS. As a matter of fact, I think the IRS has to be eliminated. Well, they have a flat or fair tax, you're going to need a collection agency. And what you do, given the corruption in the IRS, is you have to say, we start over again. And a collection agency with either system is very small in the Treasury Department. Even before we had an income tax, you had a Treasury collection agency to make sure the excise tax and other taxes are collected. So it's a fraction of the size of what we have today. And you have to start a new one, new culture. Now maybe in 70 years we'll get utterly corrupted again, but let's start anew. And the lesson will be an abject one of what happens when you overreach. So either one will get rid of it. And they have a small collection agency inside Treasury as used to do before we had the income tax. And by the way, just one other thing, I know you want it quick, but I have the podium and you don't. and that is, there's a beginning awareness of a major constitutional crisis coming. It's coming from the lawlessness of government. Nobody knew until that Inspector General report how extensive the abuses of the IRS was. We knew anecdotally, but no one had brought it all together. Books are now coming out and bringing it all together. Charles Murray, no slouch of a scholar, started to work on a book on the lawlessness of all these agencies. And it's amazing. The government today, because of vague rules, numerous rules, we haven't pulled it all together so we don't realize how bad it is, can get you who wants to get you. A professor pointed out the other day, I think it was at Harvard of all places, that a typical executive with responsibilities probably commits 3 felonies a day and doesn't know it because of the tens of thousands of rules out there. You know it in the tax code. If they want to get you with all these contradictory rules, vaguely written, they can get you. And so when people realize the extent of it, there's going to be a visceral reaction. What gets done about it? Murray proposes getting people together to fund foundations to fight legally. Not just a handful of cases, like some of the foundations are forced to do today because of limited resources, but fight every case and turn government's inability to be efficient, turn it like jujitsu, turn it against it. Say, we're not going to settle because you're a small individual. You got the resources. Going to defend you. And so turn the government's massiveness and inability to be quick against it. Well, maybe it'll work. And of course, initially the government will respond by doing a racketeering act against these organizations for getting in the way of their version of justice. But the fight will come. They're going to lose it. The culture of this country may have changed in certain respects, but not fundamentally. So IRS, reform of the EPA, and their illegal wars against coal and oil and gas. FEC, Federal Election Commission, going against the organizations illegally. And where's the rule of law? On Obamacare. Oh, we're not ready. Who cares about the law? And that you expect in certain countries where tyranny and authoritarianism reigns. The fact that we've seemingly passively accepted it here, no. As people realize the extent of it, they're going to say, no way. Rule of law means they're simple, understandable. You want to be law-abiding, you can. Today, you can't, because the rules are so vague. Long, but it's essential.
We got a lot of questions. The youth vote is critical. How do we develop it?
The what?
The youth. The young vote.
Youth.
Yes.
Youth are untapped resource because they're into the internet. The internet is based on freedom. None of these young people really want to have a faraway bureaucracy determining their lives. That's why they're reacting against those NSA scandals. So we just didn't get the message across. We didn't figure out how to get across to them. What the internet represents is the antithesis of big government. You want freedom. They want control. And we can cite daily examples. Now let's start with the cost of college education. Why is the cost of college so high? Because the government subsidizes it, gives out the loans, all the best of intentions, but the universities get bigger, the administrations get bloated, and you're left as an indentured servant, peonage. When you leave college, instead of getting that boost ahead, you got a mini mortgage on your back before you even start. Let's start with that and say, have you ever asked why? Why should college costs go up 4 times the rate of inflation? Why? Well, what happens? You don't have free markets operating. And more parents, you can also see a rebellion on that front. Our publisher, for example, a lot of kids are now doing it today. From North Dakota, did 2 years at a community college. Got his associate and then went to Stanford. A friend of mine, 2 years in a small community college, then went to Cornell. More and more. You don't have to do it the traditional way. Various ways to do it. Get a splendid education. You'll see more and more of that. So it's going to happen.
I'm aware that many of your writers suggest the restoration of the Glass-Steagall Act. What is your position on the restoration of Glass-Steagall?
The Glass-Steagall Act was a Depression measure separating commercial banks and investment banks. The fact of the matter is, if we had Glass-Steagall in the 2000s, we still would have had the financial crisis. Banks under Glass-Steagall were allowed to deal in mortgages, make mortgages, hold mortgages, trade in mortgages. So the crisis would have happened. The real villain, again, was the Federal Reserve. I know I sound like a guy in the hill, machine guns and survivalist and that kind of thing, going against the Fed. But the Fed is not a branch of government, like in the Constitution. Our founders did not create the Fed. It's a creature of Congress. And it's taken on, and we always worry about the Fed debasing the dollar, which caused this crisis. This talking about overreach, the Fed is now, and nobody's hit them on it, except for a few of us, has now taken on unprecedented powers, allocating where credit goes in this country. One of the things that QE, quantitative easing, has done is to direct credit at no cost to the government, big companies, and packages of mortgages, smaller, medium-sized businesses, until very recently, uncertain access to credit. That's an enormous usurpation of power, and nobody realizes it because monetary policy is the most boring subject in the world. So the Fed's got to be cut down to size. It should have only two functions. One is a stable dollar, that means linked to gold, and two, dealing with panics where you go in and get out. The British showed us how to do back in the 1860s. That's it. And it could be done with a handful of people. So I'm sounding like I'm cutting out government, but to show I'm compassionate, I will support job retraining for the Federal Reserve, for the IRS.
Please name 3 people whom you think would make effective GOP candidates in the next election.
Well, you didn't say what election, but I know which one.
Presidential.
I guess I know. Even though he got a bad rap in the campaign because they didn't use him right, Paul Ryan, he understands the Fed, understands entitlements, and is an ideas guy, so I think he would bring a level of honest debate. You don't have to agree with him on everything, but there's a guy who's into substance. I'll go more than 3. I think Marco Rubio will bring a lot if he runs. Ted Cruz if he runs. Don't gag at this one, but he was a splendid governor, did some original things. Jeb Bush in Florida. All right. Where is the exit? Yes. Elizabeth will sign the books, I'm taking the plane. Didn't say I would support the guy, but when you hear him, pretend his name is Smith. And you'll realize, gee, is he really related to George W? I mean, this shows, but anyway, he will be, and he understands some of these things, like education. I don't know if our governor, I think our Governor Christie will run. He's got, somebody said as a Democrat, no, as Christie. But he'll be a candidate. Governor Walker of Wisconsin may be a candidate. And even though a guy like Walker, people say, no. What is amazing about entrepreneurship, and you can see it in politics, is unlikely people can rise up. He didn't know what he was getting into when he did what he did. Crisis hit. Massive, unprecedented forces thrown against him. He did not wilt. So, that counts. Reagan did not wilt. That counts. And so he's not on the top of anyone's list in the pundit world. But if he makes a run, I think people are going to say he's been a governor, And he went through a Syrian crisis and did not back off and figured out how to win it. It's not knowing what to do, it's figuring out how you carry it through, especially when you get curveballs thrown your way. So I think we got a deep bench. And I don't know who I'll back, but I think it's going to be very exciting, the choices we're going to have. And whoever wins it, going through the process, will win the general election.
How can we get our message out when most voters can't even comprehend the arguments you're making? Low information voters.
Well, it's learning from Ronald Reagan. I mean, we all think he had this great gift, he did, but he worked at it. He cut his eye teeth, among other things, giving speeches to GE workers at plants all around the country. And he learned from hundreds and hundreds of experiences, talking to all different kinds of people, how you get a message across. It doesn't come from sitting down with a focus group. You learn what hits and what doesn't. In '76, he stumbled on the Panama Canal issue. Almost won the nomination then. So unless you're out there trying, you're not going to get it. So, like for example, seizing kids here by the government, some real scandals have emerged in this state. Your next governor's already talked about it in various speeches he's done. And that is, in terms of taking kids from parents, shouldn't it be done with due process? Instead of a social worker saying, I don't like what you're doing, and you have no recourse. If they seize the kid, come in with armed police, and they are allowed to seize the kid. And we all know there's a lot of abuse out there. But there should be criteria, an appeal, because this can be abused, and we've seen it time and time again. So, due process or police state? I mean, we'll learn. Gotta learn.
This person's concerned about amnesty passing. If this happens, what effect will it have on our economy?
What effect will it have on the economy? The key thing to the economy is not going to be the immigration bill. It's going to be getting it right on the big things. This is a very big and rich country. We get it right on the dollar as good as gold, get it right on taxes, get it right on patient control of health care, get it right on spending. I mean, on spending, you can sound like an eye shade, or you can make the point. Where do those resources come from? They don't come from manna from heaven, they come from you, through taxation, borrowing and printing of money, which is another form of taxation. You begin to get those things right and we come roaring back again. I hark back to 1979, 1980. I was a young man then. Kids don't believe it, but I was once young. And there was real deep pessimism about the future of this country. The world looked like it was passing us by. The Soviet Union looked like it was on the ascendancy. And then Reagan comes in. There's a few basic things. And we come roaring back. And Reagan knew how to focus on the big things. I'll just give you one little story about knowing what to focus on. Early in his administration, as often happens with these things, big fights among his people, internal fights. Haig and others trashing each other in the press, leaks all over the place, looked like utter disarray. So two reporters, Evans and Novak, columnists back then, asked the president, what are you doing about this disarray, all this cacophony among your own people? Reagan, as he often did, responded with a story. In this case, two psychiatrists, a young psychiatrist and an older one. They go to work together each day. At the end of each day, the older one looks as serene and calm at the end of the day as at the beginning. The younger one is always bedraggled, drained by all the things that, all the patients he dealt with. Finally, he asked the older psychiatrist, how do you do it? How do you end the day and look as fresh as you did at the beginning of the day? The older psychiatrist replied, I don't listen.
country. That is the root to the decline in freedom and liberty.
There is cultural decay. I mentioned Charles Murray earlier. He had a book that came out, I think, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, focused on white people, so we can avoid the whole racial issue. And contrasted the state of our population in 1960 and today. So even though we focus on minorities and that kind of thing, no, this cuts across the board. Huge amount of people born out of wedlock, now 30%. And so, there are exceptions, but it's awfully hard to raise kids if you don't have a man and woman or two parents fighting, doing this hard enough as it is. So anyway, Murray does this decline. The amazing thing is, we know what's right. We can turn this around. That's why I think we're going to turn it around in terms of abuse of government. We got a little indication, the story today about obesity among young kids going down a little bit. In a free society, it's not government that does these things. It's getting information out and people saying, something's gone dreadfully wrong and we've got to do something. I'll just give you one quick example, alcohol. After the American Revolution, huge turmoil, this nation became a nation of drinkers. Everyone took a swig from the jug. Old people, middle-aged people, kids, everyone was plastered by midday, by the 1820s. Truly, the amount of alcoholic consumption was several times what it is today. It was across the board, had all the predictable social consequences. What rose up from that, starting from religious leaders, was the temperance movement. It was the first public health movement in this country, purely from the people, saying if you're going to have a self-governing nation, you must have self-governing individuals. And it worked. Alcoholic consumption fell in half within a generation because of information, you got to cut back. Now, it got ruined when government got involved only in the early 20th century with Prohibition. But it was very effective when it came from civil groups, religious groups, information, getting the word out. People change. Free people change. Tocqueville, when he came to this country in the 1830s, marveled at what he called voluntary associations. People coming together for all sorts of things. You've never seen it in Europe with its medieval backgrounds where you waited to be told or waited for permission. This country, if you saw a problem or opportunity, you just did it. Got people together that did it. Well, it was healthcare, education, professional activities, sporting activities, zillions of organizations. That kind of vigorous civil life is how you turn around a corrupt culture. As people start to find their voices again and say we have to have standards again. And it will happen, even though it looks hopeless today. We have a tradition of it. And it turns around pretty quickly. Now, I think Bloomberg and others on smoking, boo, I don't smoke, but I don't like to be told. Make no mistake, starting in the early 60s, smoking's not good for you, even if you do it now. You don't have any illusion this is a healthy activity. So it's fallen down. It's not because of taxes. You have high taxes like they do in New York City. You have a bootleg market. So that doesn't stop people. What stops it is not good. When you do patch or anything else, you deal with it. It was this country, by the way, and then we'll get the next question, that invented AA. Wilson in the 30s. It's quite a story. It wasn't enough to say stop the drinking. You have support, and some people like it, some don't. But it's helped millions of people get back on their feet again. Civil society coming up with this. Not some scientific thing. Somebody's insight does it. Happens all the time. It'll happen with our crazy culture.
How can you counteract the entitlement mentality of the receivers, especially the illegal alien?
On entitlements, there are two parts of it. One is the things we see now with disability, the government encouraging you to go on food stamps and the like. The better economy reforms will be made in those areas. You've got to have the right environment to do it. We did it with welfare reform in the 1990s. It took a while to do it, but it happens. On the big entitlements, healthcare or Medicare and Social Security, I worry less about those, and here's why. Most people who get Social Security don't feel they're on welfare because you were told during your working life you were being taxed, the money was being put aside to pay for your future benefits. So this wasn't a freebie, you paid for your whole life. Now, the fact that they, I was going to use the P word, the money away, doesn't get around the fact that you paid for your lifetime for these benefits, and the return you got for the money you put in is miserable. You'd have been better off in a traditional annuity than what you're getting from the government. So that's not a, they call it entitlement, but that wasn't a corrupting thing. It was run corruptly, but it was not a, same thing with Medicare. You paid those Medicare taxes, you're supposed to get something when you reach age 65, if you chose to do so. And so those can be positively reformed. There are two ways to reform those. One is what you might call the root canal without anesthesia. That is, say on Social Security, if you raise the retirement age to 88, no problem. System solved. Or on Medicare, euthanasia when you reach the age of 70. Problem solved. But you know, the amazing thing is, and then I better get to signing the books, Elizabeth and I. The amazing thing is that for all the abuses from Washington, Sacramento, and Trenton, and elsewhere, we have enough wealth in this nation, this is astonishing, to pay retirements promised on those who are on Social Security and about to go on Social Security. It won't come from the trust funds because that's a sham. It'll have to come from general revenue. But we have enough wealth to do it. Same thing on Medicare. Problem is, younger people, and show how old I am, this is 55 and under, is where the problem is. So what do you do on Social Security? You allow personal accounts for younger people. So the bulk of the payroll tax goes in your personal account with sensible rules and diversification. No buying racehorses in Thailand or anything like that. Very vanilla stuff. As you get older, more into fixed income instruments where you get this thing called interest. Remember a thing called interest? Get interest back again when we have a gold dollar. And you'll get far more in retirement than what you get from Social Security. You turn liabilities into assets. And with younger people, have a profound impact. Kid gets a part-time job in the summer, suddenly accumulating something called capital. What is it? How do I grow it? And they realize it, even if they don't articulate it. They realize this comes from their labor, not a gift from Washington. It's their labor that produced this thing. They're going to treat it very differently than what is done today with Social Security, turning liability into an asset. So as the older ones go to our ultimate reward, liabilities go down, have a huge base of assets being created, and the key thing is a different mentality. On healthcare, as chatted on earlier, it's a matter of free markets. If you start to get a little bit of productivity in healthcare, which you will with free markets, effective safety nets, those unfunded liabilities come crashing down because they're based on 75-year projections, and a few changes today has a huge run of knock-on effects as you accumulated, compounded over 75 years. So that's how you do it. Paul Ryan will tell you, you don't have to take anything away from anyone today. If you're on the system, like it or not, you're going to get what was promised you. The younger people is where the big problem comes in various ways to turn these liabilities into assets. And that's what we got to get across. And it didn't get across last time. You'd think from the last couple of elections that wheelchairs were invented to make it easier to get grandma off the cliff. I mean, that's crazy. Well, with that, we better get to the book signing and say again, have Elizabeth, thank you, Conservative Forum.
We're going to go and get
want to let you know that we did sell out on books, but the bookstore up the street, Books Incorporated, 301 Castro, does have books. Unfortunately, we've already sold all the ones that they brought.
If you want a signed book and we run out here, send me at Forbes Media, 60 Fifth Avenue, a book plate, and I will sign it.
What was the name of the book?